I remember well and love. Some of you I don't know, and that's great.
Probably better.
Thank you very much. As I worked on my memories and what I'm about to deliver, I remember so many wonderful times being here, and I stopped myself from telling all of them. But it really is nice to have this warm reception. Directly opposite this congregation's chapel out there, a little to the left on the wall, facing me right now, and near to the door, there is a large plaque that reads, "In memory of Albert Buell Force, first minister of this church. He served this people from 1872 until his death in 1899. And at the bottom of the plaque is a quotation, "Blessed are the pure in heart." This entire plaque caught my eye when I first began here as a minister in 1977, partly because there is in it more than a hint of affection and even a deep reverence for Albert Force, an intensity of reverent feeling that has not been typical of this congregation in relation to its other ministers. So I've always been curious about Albert Force, and when I was offered this opportunity, I decided I would try to find out more about him. And this is what I found out. He was born in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania on November 27, 1831. His father was an attorney. His mother was a teacher. He spent 3 years at Bucknell University at Lewisburg. He studied at the law school there at Bucknell, and he may have served as a private in the Civil War, in the War of Southern Rebellion. Eventually, he decided he was more suited
The
to
war of Northern Aggression.
I was ready for that. Eventually, he decided he was more suited to the ministry. So he attended Meadville Theological School, which was then in Meadville, Pennsylvania, also a small town. He left without graduating to take charge of the Unitarian Church in his hometown, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. All of this suggests that unlike many Unitarian ministers at this time, he did not come from a family of means, and he struggled to earn what it took to survive in the ministry. He struggled so much, he could not afford to graduate either from Bucknell or from Meadville. His second parish was in Sandwich, Massachusetts, where he met and married Harriet Ellen White. He was then called to Littleton, Massachusetts for a brief stay, and then to the first parish in Needham in 1871. While in Needham, and this, by the way, remember, this was still Needham at that point. While in Needham, a group of people from Wellesley Hills, then called Grantville, regularly made their way over to hear him preach, and they were impressed. They had already decided that there needed to be a Unitarian church in Grantville because Needham was a far stretch, and they wanted Force to be their minister. Now let me pause to point out that these were powerful people who founded this congregation. Like most New Englanders, they would have expected their leadership to come from Harvard or from a few leading Unitarian families whose names were well known to them. So they were attracted, in actual fact, to the ministry of this young man from rural Pennsylvania. In those days, New Englanders didn't even know where Pennsylvania was. I agree. As the reporter who wrote said, how well he performed the arduous duties imposed upon him, we all know. He was not only believed by his parishioners, but the whole community loved and esteemed him as a citizen, as a neighbor, as a religious teacher and pastor. The memory of this pure, gentle, unselfish life will for years exert an influence for good in this community. As the minister of the Hills Congregational Society once said, every time I meet Reverend Vorse, I feel better about myself for the rest of the day. Gabriel Bradford, who was a local historian, remembers he was quiet, reserved, and seemed almost shy. But there was an atmosphere of peculiarly intimate, utterly unpretentious sanctity about him, which impressed even a childhood so indifferent and so erratic as mine. He continued. The life of the church in those days was full of activity, of course, of lectures together with coffee parties through the winter months, 2 or 3 day fair, usually held in a tent on the lawn beside the chapel. This, by the way, is not what they were referring to as the chapel. A midsummer picnic, always events in which the whole community was interested, and all of which helped the church finances. The parsonage apparently was on the way home. It was out here on Washington Street. It was on the way home from school. So many of the children in Granville, it was not unusual for them to come in one door of the parsonage, past the cookie jar. Harriet kept filled with cookies every day, and they left the building with their hands full of cookies. According to contemporaries, he was not a particularly good preacher. And as far as I can tell, there is not a word of what he has written that survives. But he loved this congregation in growing and living and being stronger. And when his love was not enough, he gave considerably out of his own small salary. Back then, he earned $1,500 a year, and he gave substantially out of that salary to keep the church going. The bond that formed between those wealthy and strong-willed New Englanders and a child of small-town Pennsylvania established a foundation upon which this congregation was built. They could have chosen many other young candidates to lead them, but they did not, because Albert and Harriet, a self-giving young man and woman, were who they wanted to lead them as newly liberal religious people. It's very interesting. I found, this is not in the script, but it came to my mind as I was talking to Mark over supper. As an interim minister, I've followed ministers for 12 years, and almost every minister is described to me as a great preacher. And I've read their sermons, and they weren't that good. But they were really neat people. They were really nice people. And I think that what people hear, half of what you hear when you listen to a preacher that you know well, is that person's personality and how you feel about that person. And all of the moments you may have had of a pastoral nature and all of the relaxed, intimate moments you may have had, you hear a lot more than what he or she wrote down on a piece of paper. And someone like me coming along years later will wonder why that person was thought to be such a great preacher. When in fact, that person was a very good minister, and it came through in the sermons that he or she preached. Which is what saves ministry, really. Over the 23 years that I was your minister, I found all kinds of stories that fascinated me, as this one did. And my assignment for this talk, which was not to tell a history, but to find some interesting stories in that history has shaped what I'm going to do. You have one history. It was ably written by Mark Chetna. I have read it over several times, and I am not going to cover the same material that he covered. I am indebted to him, however, for pulling things together in a way that no one else has been able to do. And I disagree with him on only one or 2 points of emphasis, which I will not belabor tonight. I want to talk to you briefly about your historic name and how it came to be. Legally, you are still the Unitarian Society of Wellesley Hills, since only the legislature can change your name. And you can imagine that's a slow process. You were originally the Grantville Unitarian Society. As Mark writes, the congregation first requested that they be allowed to call themselves the Grantville Unitarian Society. Now, why did they call themselves a society and not a church? It's a question that I've asked myself over the years that I was your minister, and even now. And the answer that I have arrived at is that they didn't have a choice legally. They didn't have a choice. Nearly all Unitarian and Universalist congregations founded in the 19th century, including our neighbors in West Newton, had to be called societies, because the state law required, I believe, that incorporators of a corporation called a church had to subscribe to a written statement of beliefs. In other words, a creed. The founders of what now calls himself UUSWH refused to set conditions for membership in their congregation. And so their name became what the state would allow it to be at that time. The Grantville Unitarian Society, although they defiantly referred to it ever afterwards, and up until recently, at least during my ministry, as the church. This became clear when you look at the plaque, which I mentioned at the start of my talk, which is right outside this room, which describes Albert Vorse as the first minister of this church. My surmise is that church is what they would have named it if the law had been different. Our neighbor up the street, that way, was founded at about the same time and named the Grantville Religious Society, aka the Orthodox Trinitarian Congregational Society, later the Wellesley Hills Congregation Society. And when the political climate would allow it, they petitioned the legislature again and became the Wellesley Hills Congregational Church, which they are now, and which they have wanted to be all along. Why our founders did not take advantage of that change in legislative attitude is a matter of conjecture. It may have been a matter of principle to them that the word church suggested something that could cause some of their members to feel excluded. Or, as I suspect more likely, it may have been a matter of pure indifference. They knew what they were, the town knew what they were, everyone called them a church, and they saw no reason to go to the enormous effort to get the legislature to make a change. I think that's the mystery behind the name. There may be all kinds of other reasons why this congregation would want to call itself something different, but that's why they called it that. Yeah. In a similar vein, I want to address the Celtic cross on the steeple. I hope this is not news to most of you. I first became aware of it during coffee hour in my first year, when two visitors from California accosted me, demanding to know why there was a cross on the steeple. And I struggled to explain what I knew about the Christian roots of New England Unitarianism when Ken Wells, who had grown up in this church, I think his father had grown up in this church as well, overheard the conversation, and he stopped by and said, "Is there a cross on this?" The next day I asked Frank Parker, who had encouraged my interest in New England church history. I did some thinking about it, coming up with the theory which Mark reports, that H.H. Honeywell contributed substantially to the cost of building this church, even though, as far as we know, he was a Unitarian. Yeah, but he was a generous guy, and he had certain visions for Wellesley, and having this church was one of them. So he contributed to it. He may have had something to do with suggesting that the church that was going to receive that much money from him was going to have a Celtic cross. Why didn't the founders object or not take his money? As with the name society, when they actually called themselves a church, they knew who they were, and they didn't think the ornament of a cross would make much difference to them in the community. Besides, it probably fit with their concept, the architect's concept at least, that they were building an English country church. That was what this was supposed to resemble, and it did. One other question I want to tackle, which concerns the early years of the congregation and much more. Why do Unitarian Universalists have church services consistently? Why do they not have church services consistently through the summer? It came up when I was the minister here, and I'm sure it comes up today. The answer I usually give is that we are the only religious people that God trusts. Glib as that was, does not really answer an honest question. There are actually two questions in that, and the first is, how does it start? I got a hint of this when I discovered that Rice House, where the congregation's offices are, was the residence of the innkeeper who worked at the Elm Park Hotel, which was over here where the clock tower now is. Local Histories of Wellesley Hills tells us that people used to move out from Boston during the summer to stay at the Elm Park Hotel. They also took the trains to the South Shore, Cape Cod, and New Hampshire every summer, religiously. My mother's family did this. Why would they do a thing like that? I think the obvious answer to that question, or what seems obvious to me, is fear of air and waterborne disease. Boston's summer weather became a perfect incubating ground for contagious diseases. That is, I believe, why middle and upper middle class Bostonians took off for healthier environments. And a good many of them were Unitarians and Congregationalists. And since they were not going to be in town, they cut a deal with their ministers that gave them the summer off too. And the pattern was set that replicated itself throughout the country for many years. Now, in every place but New England, Unitarian Universalist congregations have services 52 weeks a year. The traditional 8-week ministerial vacation, and I add to those of you who granted me that vacation, I had a wonderful time. But it no longer exists.
Go to France.
Well, that's actually our plan. It no longer exists in many places. Lay and minister-led services throughout the summer are common in many locations, even here in Massachusetts. I think it's fair to say that many UUs have come to enjoy a different sort of summer with more flexibility about what they will do on their Sundays, and they exercise that freedom in July and August. And God bless them. I am guessing, however, there will come a time when church will be open all year round for those who wish it to be open. And I think that's probably going to be a good thing. I want to move our focus a little later in time and talk about Charles Francis Potter, whom many of you have not heard about, although Mark mentions him. I got quite fascinated with him. He was the minister here for only 2 years, in 1918 and 1919. He was an up-and-coming young man who had been serving the Unitarian parish in Marlborough, but when Marlborough neglected to pay him what they had promised, he walked out on them and followed the lure to Wellesley Hills. He came to Wellesley with great expectations on the part of the congregation. In the chapter on Wellesley Hills that's included in his autobiography called The Preacher and I, he wrote, "One of the most colorful of the many interesting people in our town, in our new parish, was a lively woman of 80, a wealthy widow and daughter of a railroad man. She arrived at the parsonage as soon as we had the furniture unpacked and arranged, and immediately said to my wife, 'Oh no, that sofa should be over there, and that chair belongs here. Oh no, this is all wrong. My God, we've never had the parsonage arranged this way.' Mrs. Porter walked up to the domineering little old lady, looked her straight in the eye, and said, 'This is the parsonage, true enough. But while I'm living in it, it is my home, and I shall arrange the furniture exactly as I please.'" Charles Francis Potter writes, "I was aghast at my wife's temerity. For peace in the parish seemed to be more important than the arrangement of furniture. But to my surprise and relief, Mrs. Hill actually embraced Mrs. Potter and explained, 'My dear child, I have been waiting for 40 years to find a minister's wife with spunk.' You're quite right about the furniture, of course. You and I will get along famously." Later, Potter wrote about this ministry, "My pastorate extended as nearly as I can remember, from April 1918 to November 1919. The main world historical event of that time was the armistice, November 11th, 1918. I remember rushing across Washington Street from the parsonage to the church and ringing the bell with such vigor and for such a long time that I was mildly reproved therefore. Another event was the influenza epidemic, a few weeks before the armistice. We discontinued church services for a time in order to avoid spreading the contagious disease. Many of the church people worked at a temporary hospital, which was set up in the Magus Club, and I went to the homeopathic hospital in Boston and served as an orderly and general assistant. When it was discovered I was a clergyman, I was assigned the duty of informing the dying of their approaching death and asking if they had any messages for their relatives. None of them would believe it, however. I find that a Boston newspaper on October 5th, 1918 reported that the bulletin board on our church lawn contained the inscription, "Church closed. Ignoring disease never was and never will be good religion." And then the minister, this is Potter, referring to himself in the third person. The minister apparently said, "If you could hear what the overworked nurses and doctors in the various hospitals are saying about the clergymen who persist in herding their followers together in defiance of the laws of health during this epidemic, you would realize the truth of the sentence on our church bulletin board." Potter continues on another topic. "When I arrived in Wellesley, the congregational Ministers in both Wellesley and the Hills were very friendly. The college authorities were suspicious and standoffish. Well, we were gradually, I don't imagine that changed, but we were gradually able to dissipate that attitude. Catherine Lee Bates, author of America the Beautiful, and a very fine liberal thinker, was the head of the English Literature Department at Wellesley. Her companion, or her housekeeper, had a daughter in our Sunday school. And in making a pastoral call, I met, became acquainted with, and grew to admire greatly the sturdy character of Catherine Lee Bates. Through her influence and that of others, both inside and outside the chapel of the college, I was invited to preach at the Wellesley College Chapel. Miss Bates told me I had better do my best and make it inspiring without being controversial, because I was the second Unitarian to preach in the Wellesley Chapel since the foundation of the college, and they hated the first one. You went on to say that Roger Babson skipped out of the regular Hills Congregational Church and slipped into the Unitarian Society in time for the sermon. He was thoroughly familiar with the thoughts of his own congregational minister. He was just checking to see if Potter had any new ideas. Potter continued to have difficulties over money. For example, he frequently had to intercept the treasurer at the end of the day at the Wellesley Hills Railroad Station in order to get paid. Treasurer would give him whatever he had in his pocket and promised to pay him the rest, which he never did. Potter had explicitly written into his letter of call that if he were to reach certain goals, he would receive a significant salary increase. Come the 1919 annual meeting, he not only met those goals, but also welcomed 75 new members and accumulated a $4,000 surplus. But no raise was proposed or voted. He met the treasurer again at the Wellesley Railroad Station, Wellesley Hills Railroad Station, and he said, "So, what happened last night? I did all of these things you asked me to do, oh, Charlie, I'm so sorry we forgot. But I'll tell you what, we'll do it next year." And the next day, he accepted an offer from the Lenox Avenue Unitarian Church in New York City. And Mark, that's why he went to New York City so quickly. We get some water here. Yep. James Luther Adams was served this church from 1934 to 35. He was the son of a fundamentalist preacher who grew up in Washington State, graduated from the University of Minnesota and Harvard Divinity School. He first served the Second Church Unitarian in Salem, where he became very much involved with the labor movement. I'm sure a little surprised that Wellesley Hills called him after that. They did. He moved with his wife Margaret and daughters to Wellesley Hills. As a young man, I think he was probably quite a handful for this quiet suburban congregation. But when I first came here, I found several people who remembered him with great affection. Catherine Hall was one of them, and there were several other people I remember who really lit up when you mentioned Jim Adams. There is much to say about Adams, and I'm not going to say even half of it. I want to focus on his founding of the Commission of Appraisal in 1934. You remember 1934 was deep into the Great Depression, which impacted congregations as much as it did every other American institution. With very little money coming in anywhere, congregations became depressed themselves. Their numbers were diminishing because many people do not seek out congregations when their own personal fortunes are threatened. Their ministers were demoralized. Many of their lay leaders were out of work or fearing that they soon would be. In addition, the American Unitarian Association, which was the forerunner of the UUA, saw itself only as an institutional spokesman for its member congregations. It published pamphlets, came out press releases, corresponded with religious liberals in other countries, and that was about it. James Luther Adams and Kenneth McDougal, a layperson from this congregation, began meeting in the minister's study of this church. This is the minister's study. This is where they meet. There used to be a fireplace, I believe, over here. And my guess is that there were bookcases along the wall, one way or another. I think the stage probably was not here, it was a desk. This was the minister's study. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some way to open up that side of it so that this room could be used for overflow crowds such as they would have had on Christmas Eve. This is where they met. They began meeting and invited various other people in and began grousing about what was happening. I imagine that this was a time of great tension for the Unitarians. In any event, the young Turks who met here saw that a continuation of the present state of things would lead to the dissolution of the American Unitarian Association and the gradual disappearance of Unitarianism from the religious scene, not unlike what has happened to religious movements like the Swedenborgian. The group that met in your chapel raised hell and proposed the creation of a commission of appraisal, which wrote a report titled Unitarians Face a New Age. The opening chapter of that report will give you a sense of how they saw the situation. I suspect Jim Adams wrote it. In a time when revolution, remember this is 1934-35, in a time of revolution when chaos and revolution are everywhere, threatening, where ideas are again forming an alliance with tyranny and dogmatism, when intellectual confusion and social discontentment are blindly trying to fight their way out of situations where only the problem-solving temper of mind can be of real help. When a fresh birth of the nationalistic spirit is everywhere offering its spurious comfort to tired and discouraged people, in times like ours, there is an imperative need for a religious fellowship that will bring order and hope and confidence to those in the liberal tradition. Commission, headed by Frederick May Elliott, who eventually put many of these ideas into practice as president of the American Unitarian Association during a period of substantial growth that followed this commission. This story would fill a book in itself, but suffice it to say that the meetings, which started in this room, that is now your chapel, then the minister's office, may have saved our movement. Adams left Wellesley to travel through Nazi Europe and study what was happening there. He found many religious institutions caved in to Nazi pressures because their fundamental beliefs did not include a commitment to the survival of liberty or justice. As a consequence, they caved in to Nazi pressure. Even the two small, by-name Unitarian sects in Germany, whose highest goal was the progress of man onward and upward forever, allowed themselves to find that progress in Hitler's racial policies. What Adams brought back and what became the keystone of his thinking was the question, and this is my phrasing of it, what is it about your religion that stands up to tyranny? Adams went on to teach at Meadville Theological School, where I studied, which was then in Chicago and also at Harvard. He is noted for introducing Paul Tillich to America, but at Meadville he is remembered most fondly for this. On winter nights, when the cold air came flowing off of Lake Michigan, and the furnace, to keep up with it, blew heat up through the building, it caused the stacks in the library to do a great deal of creaking. Students were then told, newcomers to Meadville, that this was the ghost of Jim Adams, still combing the stacks for a book he had not yet written. This affectionate tribute reflects the high esteem in which your former minister was held in the minds even of some fairly cynical seminarians. The next minister they chose, and I follow through all of them, the next minister they chose was Waitsel Hastings Sharp. He was born and brought up in Boston, educated at Harvard. He worked in religious education for a while for the AUA, and in 1936 was called to Wellesley. Waitsel and Martha Sharp had 2 young children, and I'm sure that for a time the congregation felt that this time, they had called the right young minister and wife to lead the youth movement they had been trying to cultivate under Potter and Adams and probably even Walter Swisher. But in a short course of time, the Sharps were recruited by the AUA to help those liberals most endangered by Hitler to flee from the Nazi invasion. I think probably many of you have seen the film and the pictures that were produced by Waitsel's grandson, Tim. You know this work was enormously helpful and that it was enabled by the congregation, which not only gave their minister the time, but it also agreed to undertake the care of the Sharp children during the year and a half that their parents were away. These children were a handful, as you can imagine. Confused and resentful, understandably, about why and where their parents had gone, their care was not an easy task. And yet, whatever stress of caring, and shortly after that promise, they got another call from the AUA asking them to go again to Europe to finish their rescue work. As Waitsel told it on a tape recording of his decision, he explained to the caller from the AUA that he and his wife had made a promise to their children that they would not leave them like this again. And he was told by the person at the other end of the phone, who was in a position to say it and mean it. If you ever hope to serve a church in the AUA again, you will go to Europe. And he did, and they did. So they went. This story of what happened next has been told many times, so I won't belabor it now. Their work was successful. They have been recognized by the nation of Israel and somewhat belatedly by the service committee with credit for their good work. After their return, Waitsel and Martha's marriage came apart. He left for another Unitarian parish in the Midwest, and she remained to run for Congress in this district against an opponent who was then the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Republican Joe Martin, who won. When he departed, Waitsel left a shoebox of tapes in which he described the ups and downs of his experiences in espionage. And that is what it was. I listened to every one of those tapes, and I wish we could too, because parts of it are as exciting as a spy novel. He really was playing fast and loose in a country that was rapidly being taken over by the Nazis. I hope those tapes are still here, but I fear they are probably not. And that's a loss, although Tim, his grandson, still has them. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have included Bill Rice, but I wanted to let the dust settle around his ministry. Now, I think something can be said. In the baby boomer era, he built this congregation up to numbers it will never see again. No congregation will ever see again. 600, 700 members here in Wellesley Hills. I wish you all the best, but we're not going to get there. Now, and it wasn't Bill Rice's, entirely Bill Rice's credit either. Every church minister opened the doors, and this incredible flock of people started coming in, registering their children, signing up, pledging, and they had no idea what they were doing right. Until 1966, when the whole thing stopped. And then they thought they were all at fault. And one of the saddest things, because I talked to some of these guys that rode the crest of the wave up, and they couldn't understand what happened when the demographics, because that's what it was, when the demographics turned against them. Anyways, Bill built this congregation up. It probably will never be that size again. He helped to found the Human Relations Service with Eric Lindemann. Eric Lindemann was one of the people who made both the pioneering work on grief and based on his studies of the Coconut Grove fire families. And Human HRS, I've been on the board of that. It's a wonderful group. He conducted a well-known prison ministry on Sunday afternoons. Most ministers on Sunday afternoons go home and if they're drinking people, not Bill Rice. He had the energy to go to the Charles Street jail and took Chandler Gregg with him. And Chandler played the organ and Bill preached. Chandler said that their favorite hymn was "Steal Away." Bill was born into a Universalist family and graduated from Universalist Theological School, but served only Unitarian churches, serving 9 years in Dover, at the Dover Church, and 25 years here. His father was an architect. This may not surprise you, and he worked as one for several years before he decided to finish his training for the parish ministry. Guess whose hand was on the drawings for the sanctuary where you worship? Bill's greatest accomplishment, however, was not the sanctuary, but came as the chair of the Merger Commission. The AUA and the Universalist Church of America had been making diplomatic gestures at each other for several years. In 1956, Bill Rice became the chair of the commission to engineer the discussions about merger. According to the Dictionary of American Unitarian Universalism, he did a remarkable job of encouraging a process which would enable congregations to decide whether this merger was something they wanted to have. And they finally did decide to merge the two denominations. When the merger came, the next step was to elect someone to head the new denomination. Presidents of each denomination, the Unitarians and the Universalists, agreed that they would not throw their hard hats into the ring. But under pressure from some of his friends, Daniel Greeley, the AUA president, reneged on this agreement. The agreement, by the way, had been secret. Well, very few people knew about it. Not knowing that Dana was in the ring, Bill entered the election, thinking he had a good chance of winning. He found himself in a race against the most popular Unitarian in the country. he lost a close and hard-fought campaign by 1,335 to 980. According to some of his parishioners, it was never the same again. I found a letter behind the papers he left behind, I don't know whether deliberately or not, from a well-known Unitarian minister, encouraging him to tell the truth about Dana's going back on his agreement not to run. Apparently that agreement had not been widely known. It could blow the lid off the election and perhaps change the result. Bill decided that the opportunity to do so was not the wise thing to do, that it would split the denomination he had spent years trying to form, and so he did not do that. And the merged denomination he carefully nurtured survived because of that choice. Because of the support of this congregation, the AUA was saved twice. These were good years for the church, and had many other distinctions. They nurtured two men as ministers who had significant influence in our denomination. The first was Bill Jones, the first minister of color that we had in the AUA, or the UUA, for many years. He retired eventually as a professor, philosophy professor in the deep South. And the other was John Hayward, who was one of my professors at Meadville Theological School, grew up in this church and referred to it fondly, who taught me to read the Bible in such a way as to make it my own. Our final notable was poetess Sylvia Plath, who was enrolled in our church school as a child, remained loyal to this church in her way. I knew her mother, Aurelia, I think many of us did, who could be a very gentle, caring person with, however, considerable mood swings, which her daughter apparently inherited. Within the first year I was here, I was encouraged to read Sylvia's book, The Bell Jar, and I did. It rather savagely parodies several members of this congregation who I know, whom I knew, and reflects Sylvia's mental illness as well as her talent as a great writer and poet. There are many stories to be told, not only of the ministers who have served you, but of the distinguished lay leaders. My time has almost run out. I don't want to let it go by without mentioning Chandler. Chandler is still one of the best organists I've ever worked with. The person I'm working with right now comes close, but no one else ever has. He taught me how to work with musicians. He taught me how to understand where musicians are coming from in relation to ministers. He could be brusque, he could be difficult, he could be temperamental, but he was always loving. And I always knew that about him. And the one story I want to tell you, several of us went to sort of place our family memorial service that his family held down at the Cape a couple of years ago. And at which it was announced that he gave a rather substantial sum of money as memorial money for the music program here. But what I remember most of all was that Chandler had a restaurant that he went to, was it once a week or every day?
Every day.
Every day. At lunch. It was a restaurant with a view out over Plymouth, which is where he lived. A view out over the harbor. And he always sat in the same place. And he always ordered the same drink. And after he died, the restaurant, every day, they set that place up. They put his drink at the place where he sat, and they wouldn't allow anyone else to sit there. Wow. That was the affection that this man generated. And I would, yes. My time has run out, at least as far as this manuscript is concerned. I'm sure as far as your patient may be concerned. You have much to be proud of and much to love in this congregation. There's so much potential. It still does. I wish you well as you carry this history into the future. And I know you will do it well. Thank you very much. Happy to answer questions. I am aware of them.
John, I'm compelled to say one thing. Despite aspersions and caps on our prior ministers, I have read your work in written works, and they do stand out.
Thank you. Thank you. I live in humility, knowing those words are somewhere, and hoping that people who read them remember. There wasn't one person.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm struck that in the history of the ministers that have been here, they have gone on to prominence either within the country or the world or within the association. Is that accidental, or was there something about Wellesley that they found attractive, or that there was such leadership here that it moved in that direction? Can you say anything about that?
I think Wellesley was in the spotlight at that time for New England Unitarians and perhaps to American Unitarians. The minister of this church was in the spotlight. I think that the members of this church chose carefully. And it's clear that they chose minister with diverse strengths, but clearly strengths. They didn't just choose somebody who happened to be available and looking for a job. They chose very carefully. And I think that's one of the reasons. Unfortunately, what it meant was that 2 or 3 of them walked off. But those ministers left their mark. That's very clear. Yeah.
Is it unfair to ask you a question that I heard you ask of Mark Harris when he came to speak a couple of years ago? And he thought he was going to speak more about the issue of elitism in our denomination or in our church. And I know you asked him and you didn't get much of an answer.
Yeah, I thought the fact that I asked him the question might allow him to speak a little bit more freely than he did. Mark Harris wrote a book on elitism in our denomination, and tracing it from the proper Bostonian for to others, and perhaps to elitisms that we're not even aware of. And it's a good book. I was curious about what he thought about here, but I don't think I can. I don't feel it, frankly. I'll put it that way. I haven't felt elitism. I did grow up in New England, but I served throughout the rest of the country. I think I would be aware of it. Yeah.
In that same vein, I'm curious about the Universalist Church in Wellesley, because I consider myself more a Universalist than a Unitarian. And the Universalist Church did not affiliate much with this Unitarian church. And I know we've talked about it. Can you just expound a little about how the difference would... At one point, they both did exist, and who would come to one and who would come to the other?
During the 50s, the Universalist Church of America decided to do some proselytizing. So they paid to establish a church in a small building that was at the corner of Weston Road and Route 9. You can't even imagine what the church is now, because there's a house built on that. But it was a small sort of barn-like building, a very cute little church. And they started to proselytize, what is it, the Fells neighborhood? Is that the
Yeah.
name? And they did pretty well. We had people, Will Paper and his wife, the Bustons, several other people whose names I have forgotten, each being what it is. But they had different people. It was never a large church. I think that they were somewhat intimidated by this congregation. This congregation boasted people who were presidents of universities. And town leaders, practically, yeah, I'm represented in town meeting, very heavily represented in town government. They cut a large swath in Wellesley, and I think the Universalists, for the most part, did not. And that's what stopped the Unitarians and the Universalists from merging for years. The old saying that, well, when I was in Canton, they have a strong church now. There isn't a church, two churches.
But John, I'm dating myself, but Will Piper was a long-standing member of his congregation who was actually, having been on the standing committee in those days, who was the largest single contributor to this congregation for many, many years. And we valued him highly.
Bill was a nature lawyer at Rose and Gray, and a very generous man. But I think that was not true of most of the others. Thank you very much.